Okay, we are back. So session number 2, we're having a little chat now about designing conditions as opposed to outcomes, which is intentionally quite provocative. Where this comes from a complexity perspective, of course, is we spoke previously about emergence and just the fact that we can't necessarily predict what outcomes we'll have. We also heard a lot about unintended consequences. Actually, by directly trying to achieve something, sometimes we get the inverse effect and make things not so great. Also recognising that there's no single path to get to an outcome. Lots of different starting points can actually achieve the same thing, and the inverse can be true as well. The same starting conditions can lead to lots of different outcomes. It doesn't mean that we're hopeless though, or that we should throw our hands up. There are lots of practices that we have to deal with this, and I'm very happy to have our guests here today. So starting on my right here, we've got Suzanne, CEO of Prevention United, very much focused on creating the conditions, the structures, the systems change to actually address prevention in mental health. So you talk about focusing on the conditions there. A lot to say there. We've got Doug Taylor, CEO of the Smith family, very much focused on how we create the conditions early for young people, recognising that by doing that, they can thrive later in life. We can't control where they're going to get to later in life, but we are thinking about how to set them up for success there. We've got Julie Batch, CEO of NRMA Insurance. Fair to say working in the height of complexity in a dynamic situation, and also a highly regulated situation there as well. I actually had the pleasure of studying with Julie at UTS Transdisciplinary School with Roger and Barbara as well. And we've got Amelia Olsen-Boyd from CSIRO, who is an executive manager there, but also a practitioner around mission-led thinking and mission-led innovation, which I have found a particularly useful framework and way of thinking about, once again, building the capacity to learn, creating variation there. So a lot to unpack in this one. Susan, you're closest to me, so why don't you kick us off? What's going on in your world when you think about complexity and think about this topic of creating the conditions as opposed to just trying to control outcomes?
A lot, and especially it's a really tough act to follow based on that prior presentation, because my mind's spinning with those outcomes. And I guess really what we're thinking about at Prevention United is the system that we have designed is not serving us very well in terms of improving mental health outcomes, particularly for children and young people. We've had significant investment in mental health service delivery, which has been really important, but we haven't seen what we would expect to happen, which is mental health outcomes actually improve over time. So Prevention United really aims to lean into that space with curiosity and think about what that missing part of that system is, which is, in our view, investment in upstream approaches to actually stop people entering that system into the first place for those mental health conditions we actually can prevent. So eating disorders, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, conduct disorder. So really what we think about is how do we work in partnership, what sectors need to be involved, how do we collaborate together, and how do we think more intentionally about the systems we're actually creating. And so some of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to the preparation for this talk is about how ready are our partners, how ready are the public to kind of have this conversation. And a big project we're actually working on at the moment is a public-facing campaign and film release in the middle of this year that really aims to bring the public on the journey that mental health conditions are in fact preventable. So we've done a really good job of stigma reduction and awareness, but we've really lagged behind in other public health approaches. And what's been beautiful about that is we already work deeply in the mental health service sector with many of our colleagues who lead work in that space. We have 21 members of the Wellbeing and Prevention Coalition, but it gives us the opportunity to bring other people on the journey. And so I really see my role in that to listen deeply to those doing place-based works, to listen deeply to First Nations community, my mental health colleagues, my local government colleagues, sports, the arts, all those other people who are doing this really amazing work, and start to collaborate and try and build consensus on the next step of a redesigned system could look like.
Just roll on. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. That's
We're
fine. Ditto. Just well said. So at the Smith family, we're focused on addressing educational inequality, as Stephen said. So 103-year-old organisation. So a lot of legacy and a lot of history and institutional knowledge and depth, of course, but with that, a lot of baggage that you carry in your work. We're at the point of thinking about where we go from here, and it's to use that movie title, Everything Everywhere All at Once. It feels like that at the moment. I mean, it does for all of us, I think. But when I look at our work and we focus on the 1.2 million children who experience income poverty in Australia, and then look at the families that we're working with in that cohort, and look at their lived experience, and we know them deeply. Talk about complexity. I mean, think about your family and the complexity that you see in your family unit. Then think about a family who experiences poverty and their enormous challenges they're experiencing. Overlay that with the education system at the moment. And any of you who've got any connection to education systems will know enormously challenging. And just to use the data view, which is only one lens on the problem and on the experience, but all indicators are at the lowest points we've had in history. And it's not just COVID that created this, preceded COVID. So you think about school attendance is at an enormously low point, achievement completion, historical low. So without getting really negative, it is hugely challenging and enormously complex. And at the same time, there is extraordinary potential. With the 72,000 students that we work with at the Smith Family Learning for Life program, we know those young people, and we see the same potential as any young person in Australia, just not the same opportunities. So that's the work that we're doing. And one dimension of a condition, and I wanted to kind of riff off what you've outlined there, which is great. We're a fundraising organisation. We raise about $150 million a year to support our work, one of the biggest fundraisers in the country. We're really alive to the fact that as we raise that money to do the necessary work, we want to be also at the same time not stereotyping people who experience poverty, but also educate the Australian community about that lived experience. So that's one of the conditions that we're trying to shape. And so we've done a lot of work in thinking about how we frame our orientation and our communication. So we put lived experience at the centre of that and give a more truer understanding, because we think that's a condition that we can potentially shift. If more people understand people's true experience, that might create more change as well.
We're just rolling.
Yeah,
It's all rolling. Okay. Well, the topic you've all been waiting for, insurance.
You might need to.
Sorry. So, I mean, I would describe insurance as a futures practice, actually. Our product and what we sell to our customers is a predictive product that tries to look forward and says, what will the interaction between the natural, the built and the human environment look like in the future, and how will it behave? And how do we set an economic indicator around that in the form of a price? So we are constantly looking backwards to look forward, and we are constantly trying to understand the changing dynamic of, rules and regulations, geopolitics, natural perils and weather and climate, and human behaviour, to try to anticipate what might come next, because we pay our claims out on a future basis. So we don't actually know what's going to happen at any point in time. So complexity is our middle name. And we're working at the moment, I think, your use of that film is a good one. I'm working on things at the moment at very different ends of the spectrum, from redesigning general insurance code of practice, working collaboratively across the industry, trying to understand regulation and law, conduct and customer expectations, and what that might look like for the next decade, to the other end of the spectrum, where we're looking at the intersection between, technology, data, product, human behaviour and artificial intelligence, at how we might redesign an organisational model to be able to absorb and respond to that. So we're constantly operating in different paradigms, and the word complexity is one we frequently use, and probably create some of our own as well.
Well, I'm curious to understand, so when you're trying to anticipate the future, what are some of the practices that you actually get the signals of the future? What does that look like?
Sure. I mean, so we look at scenario planning, plausible scenarios. We look at data analytics and insight, what that might do. We look at climate science, so lots of science in the way that we might understand. So whether you're moving between, as Roger was talking about before, the dance floor, the podium or the temple, we're always, or the laboratory, we're always in that space, sorry. So we're always moving between those, trying to get that kind of understanding of what we think might happen. Human behaviour and trends, also incredibly important. So what's happening from a population perspective, what choices are people making about how they drive, what safety features. So we're looking at all those kinds of things and trying to pull that in. But a lot of it is around prediction and scenarios.
But
Can I just jump in on that? Because it's a really helpful kind of framing. I really love the Rita McGrath's framing of weak signals in thinking about your future. I find that really, really helpful in thinking about those things that are kind of subtle in our organisation. They're really hard to hear in big organisations that are busy. But, thinking about complaints data, thinking about, incident data where there's work health safety kind of related issues, all those other kind of nascent things at the edges of the system. Having an orientation to that is really tough, but trying to develop the capacity to do that. So one thing that we do as an executive team every quarter is we have a weak signals conversation where we get part of our organisation to come and say, what's at the edge of your work at the moment that you think we need to know, that we think will be a signal for the future. Not all of them will materialise, but that's a way to kind of orientate to that future as well that we find really, really helpful.
We love complaints data.
It's your best friend.
On to me. To be a bit provocative, we are in the process of designing outcomes, not conditions. So CSIRO is currently going through a mass experiment in pushing the locus of strategic planning in the organisation way down. So as the only non-C-suite on this panel, I'll chuck a rock here. It's
I'm over here.
It's very
Me
much
too.
about saying we are going to locate the strategic thinking and the accountability at a researcher level, not in the executive anymore. And as part, I think that is a recognition of the fact that in order to get the conditions that we need as an organisation that's over 100 years old, that's trying to, and has always been mission oriented in one respect or another, that we actually need to get, we need mechanisms by which our researchers can engage really thoughtfully in these questions of what outcomes they're driving towards. And I'll give you an anecdote. When I was helping to run our missions program, which began in 2019, I would routinely encounter researchers where we'd ask a question of, well, what is the societal challenge that you're trying to solve with this work? What do you envisage the impact will be? And so many of them were so uncomfortable with engaging in that conversation. And some of them would say, I've thought about this a lot. This is profoundly anti-democratic, that I, as a scientist, should be framing up what society should want to have happen from this science. For others, it was a mode of thinking that they had never engaged in. For some, it was, their sweet spot. But I think, there's never been a more important time for everyone in organisations to consider themselves citizens first, and to take the responsibilities of that citizenship seriously and to say, we have a right and responsibility to think through what are the impacts, because the impacts of the science and technology that we produce, we know reverberate through our society, through our culture. And that there is no water's edge here where we get to say, well, we'll chuck this thing over the fence and then however it gets disseminated is somebody else's problem. So I think that once we've gone through this process and it's a bit of a painful one and it's chaotic, once we've gone through this process, we'll arrive at a cohort of researchers who are far more comfortable holding in tension the fact that they are engaged in values conversations and value strategy forming.
Yeah, there's a couple of good points there. One, it's an interesting distinction, isn't it, that idea of outcomes versus conditions, because of course it is integral to have some sense of direction. I suppose the provocation is just the recognition that we, in a truly complex situation, we just don't have control of that outcome. So in terms of what is it that we're actually doing then, if we can't control actually the mental health outcomes, or if we can't control the emergent future of science practice, what we're trying to, I suppose, pay a bit more attention to, well, what are the conditions that will increase the probability space that this will emerge in a way we would want it to? And of course, that still means being really critical and reflective, as Roger was sharing with us earlier, about assumptions and values is, a huge part of our practice is frame innovation and actually getting down to a values level to reframe. The other thing I would love for you to unpack a little bit for us, you mentioned mission, and as I did earlier, what is that? What's this mission thing?
So it's really paradoxical. It's obviously a 20th century model. It's modeled this. It's a whole idea that's been sort of rediscovered or exhumed from the mid-20th century, from things like the Apollo mission, from the Manhattan Project. And it's an idea that by setting a concrete time-bound and specific goal, you can reorient systems. And I think part of the fundamental assumption here is that what has been missing is specificity of direction. And so directional innovation is obviously something that's looking at how to harness innovative and productive forces in order to answer some of the, not solve, but make progress towards some of the challenges that we face.
And really talking at a government sort of systems level, aren't we?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think increasingly where mission-oriented practice is going is actually in the direction of recognising, I mean, there's some really great research that's been published by the OECD that talks about the paradox of missions. The paradox of missions being they're all the rage with governments, and we may be about to embark on our own national missions program in Australia via the Ambitious Australia report. They're all the rage with governments, but there is this tension when it comes to actually implementing them, which is about every incumbent institution asking the question honestly of what part of this problem am I, and what am I willing to give up in order to transform the system. And that is enormously challenging because it is so wrapped up in narratives, it's so wrapped up in the dark matter of a set of beliefs about what the state and the private sector are for, that are being currently destabilised, I would say. So I think, yes, it is something that tends to get seeded at a national level, but increasingly the kind of green shoots of this idea are coming very place-based. They're coming in people in organisations very self-reflexively, very consciously, seeing themselves as trying to stitch together a series of experiments in order to make something more than the sum of the parts.
Stephen, I think we should talk about outcomes because I think that's I'm glad you called that out because it's the inherent tension. I thought the last session was really provocative on that and helpful. I mean, as an organisation, we've got 150,000 supporters, government funding, philanthropic, corporate. So we need a sense of purpose and a sense in which we're working towards. Frankly, otherwise, it'd be hard to generate support. And there's a level of accountability. And equally, from a governance perspective, we need that in order to determine how we're travelling. But I think it comes down to then what's the role of outcomes and your role in realising those outcomes. The way I think about outcomes, they're primarily for learning and improving. They're not empirical in nature. I think that's a nonsense. It's certainly in our world, because we're largely trying to influence human behaviour. So if you see them for learning, I think they're incredibly useful. But then also being clear about, within your work, what you actually control, what you influence, but then what you contribute towards. And we think we contribute to the outcomes that we're trying to realise, and those outcomes for us are, young people attending school, achieving at school and completing at school, and after school going on to further education and employment. We are one small actor in a very complex system. The students themselves, their parents and carers, schools, teachers. Think about all the actors in a young person's life, and so we're one small part of that. So I think they play an important role, but I think understanding your relationship to them is the critical thing.
Can I jump in on that? Because I do think that's a really important point, and the strategy and those engaged in activity. And so we absolutely need mission. So Prevention United's mission is very clear for everyone in Australia to live their highest possible level of mental well-being, but we're also a small actor. But in the absence of any, whose responsibility is it then to actually deliver that outcome if we're all only individual actors within that space? And so I think the shift we're trying to create when we think about mission is to be honest about the outcome. So mental health outcomes in Australia are declining, they're declining around the world. So if we're all individual actors and that's our mission and that's not happening, how do we then think about the system that we've created to achieve that outcome is not working, and you get the outcomes of the system you've designed and the fragmentation of that system. And so as individual actors, and this is what we've tried to achieve through the Wellbeing and Prevention Coalition and broader collectives, is to kind of say what parts of the system need to change, be disbanded. And there's a balance in that of what do I need to change? How do I not be organisationally driven? How do I remain mission driven? And that might mean closing a program, which is always really tough. That might mean, that we agree to go after 3 things, and one of those things as a researcher is not my priority area of focus. And so that's where our advocacy is really sitting, that we're getting the outcomes of the systems we've designed and it's not working. And as someone who's worked in activity, we absolutely need to be delivering services. We need to be doing stuff, but we also need to be doing this other thing, which is looking at the system design that can facilitate the outcomes we want, and we all have a role to play with that. And again, just to pick up some of those conversations about trust, safety and relational ways of working. I'm an advocacy organisation. We advocate to government and they're trying to solve different problems to me. And so I have to change. And if I think about the language of public health, it is the right thing to do. Nobody argues against prevention as a good investment. They just don't want to do it. And so I have to solve those problems. So I have to demonstrate it, and working with a political consultancy is, I have to make this a political problem for them. Climate has been very successful in some ways, but ultimately failed in others. So what do we learn from these other movements that have been successful and those ones that haven't? It is deeply uncomfortable for me to sit here and talk to you today. This is not my preferred space. But I have to get out of my comfort zone and talk to different people. I can't sit in a policy room or in a client room and expect things to change. So we're constantly working at delivering the stuff we have to do while working at either incremental or ambitious change in other spaces. And I guess Amelia shared the Ambitious Australia report with me, and without this conversation I wouldn't have come across that report. But to go back to ways of working, my immediate takeaway from that report was, what if we said that's the way of working for all things in Australia, not just research, design and innovation? And really what we're leaning into in our work is saying we have this laser-focused mission, but curiosity about how we actually get there and who needs to be part of the conversation to actually make that change happen.
Yeah. Susan, can I just pick up on one thing that strikes me as someone who practices foresight methodologies is we don't have enough historians. So this idea of what are we learning from the things that have come before. Someone at a conference I was at a couple of weeks ago described it as a beautifully tended graveyard of experiments, right? And that there's this real need to, as you were talking about this morning, really exercise that learning, that capacity for learning from what has come before. And so, one of the things that my team is looking at the moment is, okay, CSIRO has previously, we tell a great story about Wi-Fi, about AirGuard, about twisties, and about laundry detergent and the things that we've invented. And one of the things that we don't have a clear sense of is what were the conditions precedent for some of those really big things that we would consider breakthroughs, because there's no institutional historian. So there's no one whose job it is to go and look and try and exhume the answers to those questions, and then hold them in tension with the fact that we could live in a very, very different world. So whatever you draw from that is useful up to a point potentially. But it just feels like a really rich vein, and I know it's something that people like Christian Basin have talked about, this need for history to feature more prominently in foresighting and scenario planning.
And can I just add into that, history as well, but the corporate voice. Like, Julie, I'm so excited that you are here, because the corporate voice, which is like 80% of workforce, the not-for-profit space we do, partnering on those conversations and learning from the knowledge that you have and seeing the corporate sector as part of the change is really critical, because you have data and insights that we don't have. And, you know, again, I talk to people about the workplace as being a parenting intervention, an inclusion intervention to improve mental health outcomes. So, yeah, I'm really interested on your reflections as somebody who's leading in the corporate space of how do we bring them back into what are these social missions?
I think, I mean, from a corporate perspective, we're constantly intersecting with community groups. We spend lots on sponsorships. We are out in communities talking to people about disasters and trying to educate and talk about safety and create safer conditions for consumers. Obviously, we do that through the lens of life safety, but also the more interaction that consumers have with their own risk and their own product, the less risk exists in the insurance product as well. So it's not always altruistic, but it's sort of a system-based view. We use lots of historical data. Like, I would say that is our capability set. So it's what happened to that building, how did that event perform, what was the customer interaction, what was the interaction with the fire brigade or the emergency service. So we're constantly looking at those things to predict. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have from a societal perspective is time. So you're just speaking then about we're going to put missions with time criticality against them, and that'll last for 3 years until the next political cycle changes, or another year until the next insurance budget needs to be built, and so on. And that's one of the things that we're trying very much to think differently about. We'll look at what a future might look like or what an ambition might look like, and then someone will say what gets measured gets done, and then you put that into measurement, suddenly you've lost your ability to actually deliver it because nobody's got the time to figure that out. And I think that's something we need to tackle together, so that different longitudinal view of what's actually happening. I've seen that more effectively used from a system perspective in Western cultures. So the political system is not on 3-year, 4-year cycles. It is about well-being, because versus reactive treatment. There are things around government intervention with corporations around, if you look at China as an example, they will put one of their critical missions as road safety, road congestion, road safety. And every corporation needs to be demonstrating what they are doing to improve road safety, sharing their data and their information. And again, that might not be a model society to use, but it's a very inspirational one around how it creates whole system change.
And I think, again, to pick up on that, and a big shout out to a report by Demos from the UK that talks about that. They talk about PDELs, which is exactly what you're talking about, that every portion of a budget needs to be demonstrated towards an agreed set of risk and protective factors. Now, we would argue they should be wellbeing, but they might include research and innovation. But that kind of, there are models that exist to take us towards collective improvement in outcomes.
Yeah, and it's really, that's very helpful. And I think that it really does then come down to governance and your orientation in institutional governance. I do some teaching in not-for-profit governance, and one of the frameworks we use was developed by a few friends in a Harvard paper called Lifting Your Gaze to See the System. It's a really terrific paper. But talks about governance in 3 levels: corporate governance, governing for outcomes, and governing in a system. And I think the more that organisations think about their place in the system and their role in the system, and the idea of citizenship, we talk in the Smith family about system citizenship. So how are we good citizens in the system in which we operate, which means being open, collaborative. And that can be hard because they're also competing for fundraising dollars and the like, but trying to do the two things at once is really important to have those kind of muscles being developed. But we're just in the process of going through a new strategic planning process and putting at the start of that kind of system view and framing from that, and then starting with a kind of a sense of, if we want to create change and be useful and make a contribution, what are the most effective kind of levers in order to kind of create some of that change? So we really think about, thinking about who do we work with that cares about this, but who's also got influence, and trying to leverage those. And when we bring it back to our work then, not just kind of thinking about collaborating beyond the system, but in terms of those outcomes and creating impact, when we look at those 2 drivers, For us, that takes us into working in households and working with families. You know, the biggest influence on a child's education is actually not teachers or schools. It's actually a parent or carer. Now, doesn't always eventuate that way, but huge opportunity. And so that kind of frames then our intervention by kind of starting with that system view. So I think you're right. The more we have in governance, that kind of system orientation, it can kind of reset the way that we work independently and then work collaboratively at the same time.
Yeah, there's a interesting tension in some respect where Julie and Amelia, Julie, you mentioned that you obviously are building a lot of models for prediction. And I'm going to assume they're pretty good for very good financial reasons. That and Amelia, you spoke about, wouldn't it be good if we could go back historically to analyse a bit more what's going on there? And it's just interesting because Roger brought up earlier the distinction between complicated, we want to really analyse, in complex, we need to probe and learn. And I think it's a healthy thing to bring up because analysing is really useful. Like they're good practices that are giving us information that perhaps are giving us pretty good enough predictions, or Doug, in your context, good enough levers that we can see some degree of progress. I think the interesting tension is recognising when we're in a different context where that no longer works, or the limits in such as, well, those conditions and drivers aren't the only factors, and there's actually multiple partial truths or competing realities, which I go back to, again, that's where, from a complexity practice, we're so interested in framing and reframing. Because the issue is that we get these models that become institutionalized. We get across entire systems certain language that you want to know about this. Well, it's the three-tier model of X, Y, and Z, of course, and that's that. And we all say, great, let's move on. And of course, again, that is still really useful because we need something that's consistent to coordinate around. But yeah, it's just an interesting tension that where you're all working in highly complex spaces, you're all needing to rely on these tools that do have their limits. And for me, that is, that is where perhaps Barbara talking about, the being, where there is a degree of intuition to this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think that there's a tendency in some of this work to be really technocratic and not human enough. And I think that, when we look at a lot of the innovation practice in Europe, a lot of it is getting more human, precisely because if only we create the exact right framing of the problem we're trying to solve and do our theory of change exactly right in our theory of action and our KPIs and everything will work out perfectly. I think that there's this movement towards trusting intuition more, allowing for emergence. And actually there's a really awesome paper that was released last week by Dark Matter Labs that's looking at the end of baseline innovation, and it's talking about how when we've been thinking about innovation over the past decade, the sort of theory of change here, I think, and from a policy perspective, was you get mission orientation because it helps the system to mature enough that it's able to lean into anticipatory innovation, which is really where you start to get into the complexity. What the provocation from dark matter is about is, well, actually, we're just immensely disrupted and chaotic now. Like, who would have predicted that the decision to bail out the Lehman Brothers in 2008 would lead to a situation where a US president would be threatening genocide? Like, it's, and the velocity at which these things are happening and the level of disruption makes it really, really hard to even anticipate. And so I think it prompts a confrontation with what are these conditions and how are we going to trust ourselves, trust one another more to navigate through them. The difference between enduring things and being resilient to them psychologically is the ability to hold multiple tools that respond to the specific context that you find yourself in. And I don't necessarily know that mechanistic, technocratic ways of doing that help. They probably bake in siloing, they bake in sort of linear models in a way that may not prove all that useful long term.
Can I just say, in relation to that, most people don't think about this stuff very much at all. And the people on this call are probably the most interested, but we are the minority of the population. And so the role of storytelling is so critical in this. And I do feel that with all of that happening, which can feel quite overwhelming, there are these stories that inspire me, like the people of Minnesota standing up against the actions of ICE officers, and the people in communities that just say, screw it, you know, our young people are important, let's just crack on and get it done. And so when we can tell those optimistic stories of where those systems and change happens, sometimes in spite of things, and grounding it in people's experience and our experience. So I see my role as kind of leading this movement in listening deeply to people and the service sector and the communities and the parents, and kind of trying to bring some of those wisdoms together in a coherent narrative of what might help. And if we don't ground it in those stories, then we lose 90% of the population. And I do feel there is some momentum and pushback against what is a tipping point. So in these strategy conversations, I do really think we need to be harnessing that disruption, because people are looking for something that don't think about this stuff at all.
I mean, I think you've got you're kind of pointing to the innate challenge of institutional life. So, you know, leading organisations for high performance, because frankly we do need efficient organisations, but also leading organisations for learning and emergence. The tension in that is just enormous, and the weight, the organisational weight, always goes to performance, and that really, unless you can find a way to ring fence and protect, that will always dominate. And so I think that's I find the hardest thing in leadership, because it's the emergence that gets us into the kind of adaptive and changeable future. You know, I mean, Hife's work I find really helpful in thinking how do we, for our leadership groups and our teams, find that time to get on the balcony, off the dance floor. Colleague Naomi has been helping us think through that. Again, that's really hard, but that's the space really, not just for leadership groups, but also finding that space for teams to do that kind of exploration, do that reflection, and do that learning. Again, really hard to kind of bake that in when you're orientated at performance. But I think, I do think leadership plays a really, really important role here in kind of demonstrating an appetite to emergence and to learning. So we're going through, as I said, a strategy process for our organisation at the moment. The number of times colleagues in the organisation ask me, so Doug, we're doing this process, but come on, tell us the answer. What is the strategy? Tell us what you really think. And from a leadership perspective, I think the most important thing I can do is actually hold back and kind of not answer that question, because kind of leave that space open, because really the better outcomes are going to come from all those different inputs, not from me kind of leading with an answer, but more leading with questions, kind of getting the right questions at the centre of that, because that's where the learning opportunity is. But again, the weight of performance and efficiency is ever pervasive, I think, in organisations.
We hear a lot about courageous leadership, and I want to go back to the wolf in sheep's clothing about the buzzwords of courageous leadership, wicked problems. I'm going to throw complex in there as well, as kind of things that glaze over that mean we don't have to do anything. Yeah. And so we went through our strategy process last year, and I fought tooth and nail with the help of a consultant to keep outcomes that we are not responsible for in our organisational measure of success. So they are changed outcomes for people with changed mental health outcomes for children and young people. Now, we are a kind of pseudo-peak body, but if we're not delivering that in our ways of working, then what is the point of our organisation? Do we need to exist? Do we need a different way? And so again, you know, when we talk about the role of leadership, having the courage to your board to say, actually, we need to contract and let others take up the space. Being able to empower your senior leaders and say, our productivity measures are going down for this strategic reason. That's the part that brings it back to the change we need to have in this space if we're going to affect that system change. And to have that conversation with a government funder, you know, that's tricky. To have that conversation with a government minister that is telling you they've got no money when damn well know they do. Or, you know, again, that they're making strategic decisions about what to invest in. that's the me change that is happening in this space to affect those bigger changes.
Julie, I'm curious if you could pick up Doug's point about that tension of sort of learning and expanding versus driving efficiency. A big organisation like NRMA Insurance, what does that look like for you? Are there particular structures, or how do you negotiate that?
I mean, my view, just reflecting on the conversation, the strategy space that we actually have to play is pretty narrow. So we push on the edges to try to expand it a little bit and say, how might we do this differently? How might we do that differently? But the constraints are vast. So we are constrained by history. We're 100 years old. We're constrained by our shareholders. We're constrained by regulation and never changing and never ending regulation. We're constrained by historical processes like budgeting. And so when you try and sit there and build out a strategy and say, how do you shift those conditions, the space is actually very, very small. So, we are trying to shift an organisation into the future with technology and what AI might do, which is probably going to challenge a number of those things that you've just brought up before, but, in terms of around free thinking and choice in a way. So we're trying to navigate all of those against a set of rules and regulations that have been built with a historical bias to them. So for us, when we're trying to push strategy, it is around how do you make a change for a consumer that's the right thing to do? How can you do that within those boundaries and constraints? What signals can you get to adjust to your point earlier, Doug, around feedback loops? So where are those feedback loops of system shift? And I do really think it's the small changes as much as those big ones that are what are driving our company forward. We've got lots of hierarchy, and I'm fortunate to sit where I sit, but I've sat right at the bottom as well. So, I've been in all those different spaces. We have the concept of hierarchy, we have organisational design, we have employee law and regulation, and all of those things really, really limit that ability to shift. And so for us, it's much around influence, system influence, bringing different thinking into as we can, creating new types of capabilities to the extent that we can to create the shift, but it's much, much longer term than we would probably like.
Can I ask you, so we obviously studied together, and our masters, probably the central theme was in some sense experimentation.
Sure.
And pushing the edges. What does that exist in your organisation? The idea of an experiment?
A little bit. It's kind of interesting. I mean, we did study together, and I was in a space at that time of being a bit angry and a bit bored. So I didn't go to crime like Roger. I went to learning how can I go and learn my way out of this? And so I met all these amazing and wonderful people that thought very differently to me. I would describe myself as a creative trapped in a numerical body, but learned lots of different things. We tried experimentation in different ways. So, insurance product design is very interesting. We built in 1921 the motor vehicle insurance product, in 1957 the home insurance product, and I think in about 1998 small business. So that is the entire description of insurance product development in the 21st century. So that's not very exciting. We try lots of different things. We've built innovation studios. We've built laboratories, so Firemark Labs. We bring the outside in, and some of those things are incredibly successful. But I would say organisationally, again, it comes down to time, the patience that you need to invest in something that's got a 10-year payoff, and what you need to do to believe that that's the right... You need individuals that believe in those right outcomes and persevere, that, putting money into that particular thing, we need to keep doing that for a decade. It's not going to pay off for that, and we've got the patience to wait for it. And organisations often don't. And I think that's the real challenge. We also build innovation on the side a lot. We're all very, very busy. I'm very, very busy. And that is a wonderful thing and a giant curse. And so what we do is we go, well, let's give people freedom and the space and the this and the that, and we'll put it on the side, we'll create the right conditions. We do those things, and lots of companies have put money into labs. And those things go off and build amazing things and they create great culture, and then everyone goes, well, now we should bring that back into the company, and we don't know how to do it. And I did that. Like I was leading our innovation lab for a couple of years, best job I've ever had in my life. Loved it, best people I've ever worked with in my life, just stimulated every single day, and it absolutely failed. Because we had not built the system that could absorb the change, and we had assumed that everybody in the company, and I'm talking about a company of 15,000 people, would be as excited as we were about the opportunities that we were creating that had zero economic value at that point in time. That we felt they had the same belief, but we hadn't trained and conditioned them that way. So a big part of my McKinsey experience was thinking about that. What could I do differently now? Having been on the outside trying to push the information in and push the excitement and the opportunity in, now I'm going to go and sit on the inside and I'm going to pull it. It's just as hard to pull it as it was to push it. Now I can't find anyone that wants to give me anything good. So I'm trying to find those people that had the same energy and excitement, in the 2 or 3 minutes a day where I can spend my time on that.
But what I really like is you're talking about the boxes needing to change to work in the system. So there's a number of levers that you're pulling there that when we try and insert things in, it doesn't work. And so I'm thinking about policy levers we could pull that make that easier to actually do, if we prioritise wellbeing outcomes. Or I heard Tanya Plibersek talk about one of her biggest successes as environment minister with not a lot of money behind it, was changing the procurement practice to have an end-to-end life cycle, and what that did for environmental outcomes. So sometimes it's for a single organisation changing it, but when we talk about shareholders, being barriers to this change, maybe we need to change our governance structures that, and again, no one from the Australian Business Council is here talking about people not acting in the best interests, financial interests of shareholders, but when we define things by economic outcomes, which is important, it's problematic. And I do think there's a really powerful conversation happening now, and I'm happy to come and do exciting things with you to help make that happen. So there is this opportunity if we change the boxes.
I think also perhaps the uncomfortable part of it is, in a similar way, having experienced like the failure of... So our missions program concluded last year, and it concluded 5 years earlier than originally anticipated. And a lot of the lessons that we learnt have been incorporated into this like broader approach, but we actually did a post-mortem. We commissioned it was supposed to be a halfway point and ended up being post-mortem on the program. And one of the interesting insights was the extent to which people are, as a cohort, capable of thinking in systems or interested in thinking in systems. And so there is a cohort for whom this comes naturally. There's a cohort for whom there's the vague outline of some possibility, but the mental models aren't there for it. And then there's a group of people who really just want to be left to doing what they're doing. And I think that's probably extreme. I think that's really legitimate in a science organisation. We need curiosity-driven science. We need people who are following that obsessive passion that they have for the specific thing that they're doing, or that deep engagement with their specific sector. But I think that part of this is about the modes in, and it's certainly been, as a leader, a lesson for me in how to go about trying to affect that change as somebody who is actually a lawyer by training. And so the idea of prosecuting a case, and if only you have the right evidence and you put forward that view, that'll be what changes people's mind. No, it's about really deeply listening and working out where is the middle ground in all of this. It's positionally much more humble work. It's incredibly personally taxing. And so one of the things that I would say to people who are working in this space is make sure that you engage in fora like this, because you're going to need to find your people if you're going to continue to do this work. And I think finding a way to be a bit, maybe stubborn's not the right word for it, but to not get discouraged. And I think that was something that Barbara spoke about on the previous panel, is this idea of the way in which these things need to transmogrify into something else. You need to protect a bit of your own energy, and find ways to not get discouraged when it doesn't work the first time. Yeah.
I think that's true. You do need to find your people, but sometimes that's easier. So my reflection would be that you can't, you can't surround yourself with only your people.
Yeah.
I know that's not your point, but my learning organisationally was where I didn't succeed was that I didn't spend my time understanding the behavioural styles of the other people and what was important to them, and therefore how I might reframe the way that I was thinking about something to make it more consumable and understandable to another person.
Yeah.
And I think if I'd started that way, unfortunately, I finished McKeesey at the end of that job. I wish I'd done it before. If I'd started with that knowledge about how to shift a system, understanding what at the end of the day are just a group of people that are working together and how to shift that system by better understanding the styles of those people, what was important to them, and the critical things I needed to be more adept at to embed myself and that opportunity, I think we'd be in a really different space.
Yeah.
And that learning came too late for me. At that time, I think we would be in a really different organisational space had I had a little bit more of that. I've had sympathy or personal adaptability.
I think that it is a humbling journey as a leader when you can reflect on those things, because I likewise have a situation where, I've had these people, they're difficult, they just will not shift. And an important reframe was thinking about that as important information about how we haven't got the tactic right, or the information or the story. Because, again, when we're talking about change mental health outcomes, when you talk about little kids, people's worry about what it's going to cost, people's worry about what do I have to do, more pressure, it all goes away. When we talk about you kind of under fives, people say, well, of course we need to do that. And so for that people or system or culture that we're trying to shift, we really need to understand the information they're trying to talk about and communicate to us as leaders to say, okay, I'm hearing that, I'm not getting that. And I can certainly reflect on the times in my career when, as a 30-year-old on a mission to change the world, I probably wasn't as sympathetic as I could have been to that view, and how I would handle it differently now, but how it's shaped the ways in which we're trying to have these conversations and affect change.
Yeah, and it is really trying, and appreciate those reflections. They're really candid and very powerful. Wouldn't it be great to do more of this in our organisations, to kind of have these opportunities to openly kind of reflect on kind of what we learned, what hasn't gone well. That's tough culturally. Some cultures, you get a target on your back when you do that sort of thing. So trying to create the right conditions and cultures where we can really openly do that. And again, that just starts with leadership groups, really, thinking about how they kind of reflect together what they're learning, and can be open, being open myself as a CEO about not having all the answers, not even pretending to have all the answers. And so that's the big, I think, the game that we all get sucked into in leadership, is that pretense that we actually, frankly, know what we're doing most of the time, when, I'll be honest, we're all pretty much just making it up as we go. And I like to kind of use that quote. In my work, I've had the privilege of working here and abroad with senior government, corporate leaders, and closely. So you have the opportunity to look behind the curtain, and you just realise that, frankly, there is no X factor, there is no secret sauce. We're all just really trying to make it up, but we pretend that we're not, and so we have this game of kind of certainty and being absolute. When in reality, it's a very different experience, I think. And so trying to be more open about that and candid, I think, is really empowering for teams. In the Smith family, I talk openly about it, be trying to have more leaders. Like, we want more people to be kind of exercising their leadership and feeling empowered to be leaders. If that just rests with people who have formal management responsibility, that's a big burden on them, on us, and it's not going to really realise the full potential of an organisation. So really trying to create that environment, more people step into that. But we've got to, I think, address the mythology of leadership that goes in hand with that, for people to kind of really embrace that opportunity as well.
I often joke that being a CEO is about asking people for money and then reporting on money they've given you. Like, it's not as fun as you think a lot of the time. So that fantasy about what leadership is, but also the accountability of that. So our youth advisory group had the opportunity to run a session at the recent Preventive Mental Health Conference, and I attended the workshop to support them in that. And it was really about elevating young voices in the decisions around mental health as the people who are most impacted by that. But they really gave it to me in that session about why we don't have a youth representative on our board. And we've had a series of work in progress to make that happen. But really, the accountability I walked out with in that session is that's actually my responsibility. So there's lots of reasons why that hasn't happened, but my action task is to actually deliver that. That's part of my responsibility as the leadership. It's something we believe in, it's aligned with our mission, it's part of our strategy. And so really thinking about there are things that are complex, but there are some things that are easy, and we need to bump them up the priority list in getting out of these systems where the busyness gets in the way of the thinking and the doing that actually facilitates change. But it's not an easy balance, but sometimes those call-out moments from a bolshy 21-year-old are incredibly important.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up on an interesting thread here where, Julie, you spoke about innovation lab outside of the organisation, no good. Amelia, yourself setting up the big mission, new infrastructure, and earlier we had Roger and Barbara talking about the studio model. And I certainly have my own story as well. I set up a care collaboration of about 10 different care organisation, community service providers. And yeah, a similar story where probably didn't quite get to where we wanted to. But what was also interesting, I was talking to someone in the government architect's office, and he was talking about just wanting to change procurement. And Julie, going back to your point about actually the small things really matter, because sometimes, yes, the big infrastructure change can do a lot of good, and of course it changes interactions and contexts, and a lot of things can happen that were perhaps constrained. Yet a big part of leadership and strategy, it's actually sensing what are the constraints and how shifting certain things can actually enable a lot of others. So in this instance, it was about small councils don't necessarily have the experience to write briefs in a way to actually bring people in. So I think in that instance, if I recall correctly, they were just looking at what's a way to better support them so that you've got lots of small local initiatives happening in a much better way. And then you could imagine from a scale perspective what that means overall. Really significant. And I suppose it comes back to the other thing, because we talk a lot about safe to fail experiments is something. So when I talk and think about experiments or increasing the capacity to learn, I think I sometimes scare a lot of people, especially clients, because they think I'm saying, let's revolutionize, let's change everything. I'm always just trying to think about changing configurations to see what can emerge. And again, trying to do that in a critical reflective practice, because I feel like the one theme across all of this is that, and Doug, to your point, can we actually do more of this in our organisation? And I've just been on a project at the moment where 3 months ago I thought we all understood the brief, and then it just feels like almost every week you keep coming back and about, all right, okay, so now we know this is the problem.
That's my everyday, yeah.
We're doing. Okay, good, yeah.
I think that's a really good call out, and my reflection of a large corporation is what we tend to do to drive change is we make an organisational design structural change, because it's too hard to shift that small thing. And so we keep going to hierarchy or org design, and we change the org design to try to get that outcome, that different outcome. Because doing the training and the timing and the, all that you need to do to leave things the same, but get a different outcome is very, very hard. So we'll shift the people. So we'll go, right, well, you're not working there anymore, you're working over there, and that's how I'm going to get that thing to, better connect or better design. So I think org structures in big, large companies are really not set up in the right way. They're set up for command and control. They're not set up for collaboration and outcome. And that's something that we're, I mentioned it before, trying to think about at the moment, particularly as technology will fundamentally change types of work. We're trying to have a think about what's the org structure and how will it be able to morph and absorb different types of technologies and different types of work, but still get the outcomes that the system needs.
Yeah, I mean, people in the room will probably be familiar with the quote that is I don't even know who it's attributed to, but I know that the Institutional Architecture Lab uses it a lot, which is we're trying to solve 21st century problems using 20th century tools in 19th century organisations and institutions. And one of the things that you start to think about is the industrial scale of the organisations. And so to go back to the conversation previous about trust being so important, it's very difficult to trust in an organisation of thousands of people because you don't know one another. There's no relational infrastructure that exists to say, I trust that you will hold collectively among your little group one another accountable for this set of outcomes. But it may be and that is kind of this really hard work that tends to get supplanted with a structural change and tends to get supplanted with things like KPIs and metrics. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and just to pick up on a theme that we've been talking about, to do with really pulling apart the set of assumptions around what kind of organisations and institutions persist and whether or not that still makes sense given the world that we exist in.
Yeah, great point. I mean, the nature of our work means, yes, we're an institution and a very old one, but what really informs us is an ecological model, an ecological way of working. You know, Brenner's model from the 70s. Everything good came out of the 70s, of course, and that's very helpful for us in terms of thinking about those different dimensions of a system in which we can make a contribution. So working, you know, in households with families, working in school contexts. We've got some ways of working where we bring school leaders together, and it's very much about trying to influence practice and leadership. But ultimately, it's a peer-to-peer model. So another way of thinking about how to change a condition was thinking about peers and how they can interact and engage, and then working more broadly at kind of a systemic level and at the kind of policy dimension. So I think that's, you know, trying to get away from the mechanistic approach into actually thinking about how people live their lives and how that informs how we work, lead our organisation, structures our way of working. I think you're right, Julie. I mean, the temptation to go on a structural lever change as opposed to the harder thing, which always goes to ways of working and culture, which gets better results, but is harder to shift and nudge, of course. But those things, I think, are much more conducive to actually how we understand the world works today from some of those more historical, perhaps, perspectives. So.
When I listen to that conversation, really what I'm thinking about is what we're talking is not about how to do it, but how to scale it, right? Because there is so many good examples where culture gets established, where system change happens, where you have, you know, decades of excellent leadership. There's a study that we reference routinely out of the US where cleaners, chefs, support workers, doctors, their primary role in the organisation, whenever you ask them, they would say, I cure cancer. And it was a mobilising around a single mission because one of the beautiful stories in that piece of research is that a cleaner, not part of their job, changed the wall art on a patient's wall because that person was there for a long time and it significantly improved their mood. So there are these examples of how you do that, but we really struggle to scale them. And so that's one of the things I'm thinking really deeply about as we go through this piece of system reform and how we're solving that problem. And shameless plug, 5% for prevention coming out this year. Really what we're looking to do is we want lawyers for prevention, parents for prevention, accountants for prevention, because there are these different types of knowledge about system levers we can pull that, as someone who comes from a psychological and health background, I don't know about and I don't think about. But when I say I want to get to this piece, this is the barrier I'm trying to overcome, those people know how to pull a different lever to me to get that done. And so when I think about who I need to collaborate with to get the kind of changed outcome, whether it's incremental or cataclysmic, which is what we're hoping for in this mid-year round, again, shameless plug, 5% for prevention, you know, we need all of those people on board to create that change. And I'm still thinking about shareholder law and company governance as a powerful lever in this that I haven't quite cracked yet.
Really glad you brought up scale, getting to, I think, a lot of the kind of the nubs of things. And, you know, I think the kind of heart of the challenge is how do we scale the impact that we want to see, that we know is necessary, without at the same time scaling our organisations, because it just adds weight and complexity. So finding that kind of balance in things and again, something that we teach in the program at New South, at Centre for Social Impact around governance, is really getting to the heart of that and looking at all the different models that can scale impact that don't mean that our organisations need to grow at the same level. And so that's kind of at the heart of how we're thinking about our future at the Smith family, because the size of the problem is just too big. We can't solve it. In fact, most organisations together can't solve it, but is there a different way to think about what can be scaled that might make a contribution to the size of the challenge that so many people experience? So I think that orientation, again, starts with governance and leadership, but if that can kind of frame the challenge, because we get stuck into the institutional mechanistic way of thinking that just goes back to the trial way of working, and I think increasingly, particularly thinking about the economic and productivity challenges, there's just no path forward. So there's got to be different ways of thinking about that. Great thing you might want to read, What's Your End Game? Stanford Social Innovation Review has a whole range of different ways of thinking about scale that goes beyond just scale of organisation at the same time.
As in, is it saying that you can scale out and up, and is that...
Yeah, different methods. So going open source and a whole lot of different approaches that they talk about. And adoption of practices and a whole lot of different ways of thinking about a view of impact.
One question I've got for all of you, because we talk a lot about the nature of these complex situations that you're in as being open. So what is the boundary? And I'm curious to, particularly for yourself, Susan, like what are the conditions for mental health? Is life, right? So how do you even go about learning about that? And I suppose for all of you, one of the things we recognise is the need for distributed sense making, that no single perspective. And for yourself, Julie, even within your organisation, how do you even get a sense of what's going on, let alone all of the different stakeholders and domains that are related to it? So yeah, I'd love just to hear, what does that look like for you guys, especially... It's interesting as we head into this world of AI, when it feels like it's so easy just to jump on to get very quick answers. What are the practices or infrastructures that you feel like are working well for you to learn and go beyond your field or key domain?
Do you want to kick off?
I want to kick off. I think we spend... So again, if I just refer back to that comment earlier about understanding the intersection of the different types of environments that we protect. So we spend a lot of time with consumers, or customers, whether it's through community groups, as in what are all the things that go wrong or have gone wrong in our product set, with governments, as what are they observing, through institutional reviews and inquiries, how do we get insights from those kinds of things that might shift and change our way of thinking. Is at the end of the day, we sell our product to people, and so better understanding that, we spend an awful lot of time there. We spend a lot of time looking outside of Australia at what is happening globally, whether it's through the trends and the way people are interacting with risk, because at the end of the day, we sort of protect people's risks so they can be more confident to do their day-to-day. We spend a lot of time understanding whether there are any global or societal trends that are emerging. We spend a lot of time looking at other organisations that look like ours but in another environment or a jurisdiction. We'd spend a lot of time looking at what other governments are doing, how are they shaping and reshaping rules and regulations that might have an impact and effect on ours. And so it is really, and we spend a lot of time looking at innovations and developments, and this might sound odd, in building structures and in motor vehicle design and repairs. And I know that's incredibly boring, but if you look at like EVs or safety technology, what's actually happening there? What does the next 10 years look like? Where are countries that are building systems, roadways, different ways of operating that are anticipating that change? And what might we be able to learn from them? How do we bring that back? And so we kind of embed that a lot in strategy and in practice.
So I think where we work and what I'm getting really comfortable with is being boundaryless. So there are many perspectives that need a seat at the table that we haven't met yet or thought about. but at the same time knowing where to start. So as I'm hearing Julie talking about roads, like road safety investment is a wellbeing outcome. You know, a person not dying on a road has huge ripple effects for a family, a community, and so they are wellbeing outcomes, and it's about how do we get that central coordination and agree what we're going to prioritise as the key kind of guiding lights of what we're trying to get to. How I stay sane in that space is also to be cognizant of the resources that we have to actually affect that change, something I'm not very good at and my body's talking to me about. Because, again, like we need to be realistic about what we can achieve, but still closely have our eye on that mission, and an inclusive practice of all are welcome and all have a perspective. But not just reaching out to those who are interested in our work, but also those who are actively not interested in our work. So we're doing some work with health insurers who have an economic motivation to address some of the rates of healthcare spending. But it's really about anyone who's got a perspective on the problem we're trying to solve needs to have a seat at the table in agreeing what are the things that we can achieve over what kind of time frame. Now, Doug's talking about child poverty. Absolutely, in Australia, we can solve child poverty. It is a stain on our nation that is happening. That is not a complex problem. We have chosen not to solve that. And we think about lots of lessons that came out of COVID around wellbeing. Wellbeing actually went up because some of those busyness, not for adolescents, but from many adults. As a parent who was homeschooling and that made my wellbeing go down, what made my wellbeing go up is no birthday parties, no after-school sport. We had time, and we had time as a family. We met our neighbours. Corporations went back to kind of prioritising key deliverables. And so we solved the homelessness problem. Like, there was lots of things. So we can actually do this. So when people tell me it's complex or we can't, we're making strategic choices not to, and that's creating other problems for us. And some of that is the 10-year payoff, you know, that people don't want to wait. But some of it's around not getting the skin in the game or sitting in the room with the people you're choosing not to solve that problem for. You know, we can talk about gambling reform, we could talk about super tax on gas. The way we've structured our economic models incentivises us to not solve those problems, and it's the same people who are impacted by not solving that problem right now. I think one of the reasons mental health is getting traction right now and solving that problem is because socioeconomic status is no longer protective against poor mental health in the way that it once was. So this is not happening to that kid over there, that impoverished family, that person who experienced racism. It is it's in the zeitgeist as there is not a family you talk to that is not impacted by mental health outcomes, and that is mobilising people to maybe think about solving this problem in a different way.
Yeah, I can just to build on that, completely agree. You know, there's a tipping point in a social problem when it can go from othering, it's other people's problem, to actually becomes a broader problem. I think housing is one of the best examples of that. I mean, that used to be those poor homeless people, and now we all know how critical it is for many of our families, and so that's a really tipping point issue. Coming back to your question, Stephen, I think, we're an organisation, a long history of kind of focus on research and evidence. And interestingly, yesterday we had a monthly update for our organisation and all staff online. And one of our team members did a reflection on one of our values, which is excellence, and talked about the fact that our focus on research and evidence often orientates us to perfection and not progress, which is a really powerful insight. I mean, that's an important, looking in the rearview mirror with research evidence is an important input, but going to Roger's lab construction, it's only one input, of course, and there are others that round out how we think about progress and momentum. But yeah, coming back to the question, so for us, what really informs us is a foundation with a theory of change. We do have an outcomes framework. We have all those mechanistic things, if you like. But I think in the previous session, there was a great conversation about assumptions and the ongoing conversation about assumptions and truly testing assumptions and determining how right and true they are. And we've just done that for our strategy process. We do it annually, and it won't surprise you, but a lot of our assumptions are no longer true, given the cost of living, given what we've most recently experienced, and now what we're leaning into again. And so that's a great input to then thinking about what we need, how we need to evolve and adapt, and how we can then build some learning loops off the back of a number of those assumptions that are either not true or really, really weak. So that's kind of a thing for us. I think it's very helpful for how we kind of guide opportunities for learning and innovation and progress.
I might just talk about a few tools that we use. So one of them is in our theories of change is this idea of a ceiling of accountability, and it's trying to mediate between this tension around system stewardship and the irreducible nature of corporate governance, which has been pulled out a little bit in this conversation. And so there are fiduciary and statutory responsibilities in terms of reporting that we can't get around, and yet if that's where we draw a line in the sand, then nothing really changes. And so what we started to do, particularly in the missions program, but we're also introducing some of this thinking into our new model, is, okay, let's envisage what is the system function that we want. And I have an excellent colleague and mentor who really helpfully frames this as being, write a list of everything that's wrong, like very specifically what's wrong in the system, and then flip it. Like it can be really, he's a researcher in innovation policy. It can really be that is a great starting point for this discussion. What are these functions? What would it look like for the system to operate? Define that at a system level. Then say, in order for that to be true, what would our networks that we participate in but don't control need to do? And then what do we need to do? And so kind of structuring our thinking in that way and saying to our executive, our responsibility stops at this ceiling of accountability, but the artifact, the boundary object of the mission itself, as it matures, will increasingly cease to be totally in the control of any one organisation. And so this is a shared artifact. So that's one thing. The other thing is this idea of trying to be quite explicit about the role of people in organisations and systems who are part of their duty is sensing. And so I think one of the most powerful functions that some of my colleagues and I play is by engaging with our researchers and building trust with them and helping them. There's a level of psychological safety that comes along with that, with working side by side, that allows you to, but you're looking across. So you see the whole picture. You don't just see one research program, you see all 30. And then you say, well, what are the common kind of complaints or issues or barriers that are bubbling up? And how does this match with the way that our executive team may be perceiving this? And so what kind of information can we, it's this intermediary function, which to me feels so critical in systems and so underexplored. And it's thinking about where do you position those kind of intermediary functions in systems so they're best able to do the work. It's not right in the centre, but it's not so politically marginalised that it doesn't have influence. And so there's a real tension there that I don't think we've explored or got totally right, but it feels really critical. There's a paper that talks about what are the functions of a mission-oriented innovation system moving forward, and it's sensing, seizing, transforming institutions. And then the last one I would say is embedding, because I think we're not great at the stickiness of the change that we're creating. There seems to be a lot of backsliding. And so working out how to make that progress durable.
Do you know, and so again, that tension, so Doug, you brought up the otherness, and I've personally had this frustration when I've worked with organisations and they will have a certain purpose statement, which of course is grand and big, and it's all...
Make your world a safer place.
Absolutely, yeah. Not pointing fingers. But Susan, I also love though that you're very intentional in being clear, because the other flip side I've had is organisations not want to think about what the greater purpose is because they just can't measure it or they can't. So there's an interesting tension there. But as we all know, if organisations don't have focus, that's one of the worst places to be, isn't it? You're spread too thin, the resource issues, the lack of clarity. But at the same time, Doug, it is a real issue when we get stuck in, well, aren't we trying to achieve this greater purpose? Why are we being so rigid? I've been up in Lismore post-floods with a community service provider, and the goal being, how do we better support this community? But they had a constraint of, well, we're a service provider. And in some way, that's really a creative constraint. That's great. and as we all know, there's that hugely limits you. It hugely limits your ability to address power imbalances, for community-led approaches, for just whole new models beyond a service. So yeah, look, there's no real easy answer for all of this, is there? And I've perhaps once again come back to the critical ongoing sense-making reflection, because we're constantly jostling between clarity, structure as helpful, to at some point it's not so helpful anymore.
My view of a purpose statement in an organisation is it is the temple. So it's the place where people go to feel connection to the organisation, absent, the physical manifestation of, Barbara's beautiful place. But it is how you as an employee feel connected to the organisation. It's where you get your energy, hopefully. It's your alignment of values, and it's your kind of moral compass. It's not necessarily the mission. So I feel like that, for me, that's what purpose is to me. It might be different to others, but that's, if I talk to people, that's why they come to work. Or we come to work because we really believe that we're helping others make your world safer. If we didn't believe that, we're just selling insurances as expensively as we can to make money. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that is what gives people that extra energy, and brings connection. Others might think it's directional, but that's kind of been my reflection over time.
Yeah, I completely agree. Probably doesn't surprise anyone in a for-purpose organisation to be talking about this, but what I think of in relation to that is then what it requires as far as leadership, which is, and I think it was maybe this previous session talked about the power of story, and maybe we talked about power. It's all blurred into one, I don't know. But I often see that as CEO, I'm actually chief storyteller more than anything, and that's how you bring purpose to life, is by kind of telling stories about what we're doing together, why we're doing it, as we discussed previously, and the kind of difference that we're making. And purpose is ultimately just the kind of the intersection of a need in the world, what you bring, and what actually works. It's the combination of those things. So, but that's of course so dynamic and changes over time. And I think to your point before about that organisation, Stephen, that the hardest thing is to kind of be open to that change and orientated to that changing world, and not your fixed model of who you think you are and who you think you need to be, which may be for yesterday. And leading an organisation through that sort of change, it's hard and at times courageous to really be open to that.
That's probably a nice place to finish things off. Massive thank you to you for being here. That was an excellent conversation, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We will be back in about half an hour. So we've got 2 conversations coming up on how we can better work across different fields, really exploring transdisciplinarity, and also a new model of cognition. So really challenging the dominant ways that we think about thinking.